welcome back to Let the Stone Speak. I'm Brent Nagtegaal, the host of the program here in Jerusalem, Israel. You might have noticed we haven't put out a podcast for a while. This is due to the Sukkot and then what came after that with the October 7 massacre of so many Israelis. And then in the aftermath of that, we kind of took a while to get back going here in Jerusalem with our archaeological endeavors. But we are pushing forward with them. One of our archaeological mentors, the late Dr. Eilat Mazar, called the biblical history of Israel the soul of the nation. And so this way, in continuing the study of ancient history and these excavations, and also documenting it and publishing it both in a scientific way and also in a more popular way, such as this podcast, it really does contribute to the soul of the nation of Israel. And so we are going to push ahead with this work in collaboration with other institutions, the Antiquities Authority, Hebrew University, and even with this interview that I did actually before the Sukkot break with Tel Aviv University's Professor Erez Ben-Yosef. In this interview I did about a few weeks ago, it's one of my favorites. It really discusses some critical discoveries that have been made in the south of Israel in the area of Timna. Professor Ben-Yosef is the director of the excavations down there. Just this massive copper mining and smelting location that dates back millennia. And really the subject and the focus of this interview with him is mainly from this time period of King David and King Solomon, going back to around 1000 B.C.E. As I said, it's one of my favorite interviews I've done so far, just because it's incredibly interesting and how cutting edge the science is coming together with a narrative as well of discovery of the site a long time ago, and then confirmation of the site's peak period of use belonging to this time period of David and Solomon, and then what the Bible says about this period as well. So please do enjoy this interview. I even have one of my colleagues, Christopher Reams, cuts in at the end with a question for Erez as well. A really insightful question and great answer. So make sure you really do watch through to the end of this interview. If you like what you see today and you want to make sure you don't miss any of our great content from the Armstrong Institute, please do like and subscribe to this video and also the channel to make sure you don't miss anything. But for now, thank you very much to Professor Ben-Yosef for taking the interview with us. And here he is discussing the massive copper mining facilities down in Timna. Professor Erez Ben-Yosef, thanks very much for coming on our show.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we're here in Tel Aviv University, where you have conducted most of your research in the field. It's a little bit further away from here and going down into the Aravah Valley. What initially piqued your interest of heading, that direction for your field of research?
I think one of the reasons is my background. I studied geology as well as archaeology as an undergrad, and also my master thesis in the earth sciences. Mm-hmm. So when I thought about research topic for my PhD, I was looking for something that can combine both fields, and working in the mines or on the mines in the south was perfect for this direction. So eventually I chose to pursue a PhD at UCSD, California. Mm-hmm. Yep. I was part of the expedition to the mines in Jordan, right, of Tom Lively, Muhammad Najjar. This was my PhD about the ancient technology of copper production. This was the beginning of my research in the south. Then when I came to Tel Aviv, I started my own project in the Timna Valley. So that was the main reason.
So this initial research you did in Jordan, it was still obviously heavily involved in the copper production industry, and you worked alongside Thomas Levy at Kibbutz and Nahas, is that correct?
This was the main site.
That was the main site, but other sites in the area as well?
Yeah.
And then your partnership with him, you just kind of went solo, heading to Timna in 2009, was that correct?
2009, I was doing like a probe in one of the sites in Timna Valley. Mm-hmm. It's a huge area with many sites. Mm-hmm. And we went to a site that was excavated before, and it was published as a New Kingdom Egyptian smelting site. And my PhD was concentrated on the ancient technology. Copper production is the most sophisticated technology of ancient times, and my PhD was about how they made copper, a new material from green stones.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to go to this site to compare the Egyptian technology to what we had in Feinan, that we knew it's Iron Age.
Mm-hmm.
This was one of the reasons why we went there. And we did a small probe, as you said, in 2009, expecting to find an Egyptian smelting site. And the difference was from the previous excavation that we had the budget for radiocarbon dating. And when all the dates came back from Oxford, not a single one of them was from the New Kingdom period. All of them came from it showed us that the activity there was from the 11th, 10th centuries B.C.E. So again, the period of King David and Solomon in Jerusalem. So that's where we understood that there is a confusion with the chronology of Timna.
Mm-hmm.
This was a small probe, and then in 2012, after I moved back to Tel Aviv, to Israel, and started teaching here, that's when the big project started. Based on our understanding that there is a lot to do, especially with the chronology,
right,
and the question who was there and what exactly was done, and if it is connected to Jerusalem or not.
Right. So this was kind of a surprise to you, as you said. You're digging a New Kingdom site, and then it comes back 10th century or in there, 11th to 9th century. I'm just interested and fascinated by that because you come from hard sciences or metallurgy interest. It's kind of outside the scope of biblical history or the biblical narrative. It's kind of separate, and yet you found yourself then, because of these dates, that hang on a second, I'm part of this debate in many ways.
Part of this debate, and it's been, I don't know, 15 years that I'm excavating and doing research on the Iron Age.
Mm-hmm.
So although I'm coming from the perspective of ancient technologies and also the archaeological sciences, of course, that there is no way but to be part of the debate about the historicity of the Bible, because we always ask, even if you come with this perspective of technology and the archaeological sciences, you always ask questions about the people behind the finds, and the people who were there, what part of what societies. And I think we have good answers for some of these questions, but it all started with trying to understand the technology in this period of copper production.
Right.
The dates came back completely different than what we expected, and the picture, this was the dramatic change in our understanding of the South.
Right.
When I started, was considered to be an Egyptian mine with the big empire responsible for all of this activity, and now we know that this was only a minor part of a much bigger production industry that was actually done by the independent tribes of the south, which we see as part of the Edomite Kingdom, the Kingdom of Edom. Mm-hmm. And of course, every year we add some more information about this kingdom, its relations with Judah, its relations with Philistia, and the finds are fascinating. Of course, they are also related to the technology. We continue to ask technological questions, and this is a part of what we do.
So in 2019, you published a paper. It was called Ancient Technology and Punctuated Change, Detecting the Emergence of the Edomite Kingdom in the Southern Levant. I thought this was fascinating because your experience up in Fainan, and then you could combine that with what you found in Timna, and now you've got the ability to make a comparison between the two over a large geographic area, and you can determine, I guess from this paper, the technological advances when they happened, and what was kind of the main thrust behind this paper, or what did you find?
Well, first, the striking observation was that every little advancement in the technology of copper production was done simultaneously in both regions. So
how far? What's the distance between the two?
More than 100 kilometers apart, so they are quite far away from each other. Feinan is about 50 kilometers south of the Dead Sea.
Okay.
And Timna is very close to the Gulf of Eilat, 20 kilometers north of the Gulf of Eilat. So there's a huge area of desert between these regions. The main observation was that the technology, again, it's a sophisticated technology. There is a lot of variables and things that got into it, from the preparation of charcoal and the mining of ore. And in this stage, they also mined what we call flux, another type of mineral that they knew how to mix it with the copper ore in order to make the process more efficient. There's a lot of things that are part of this industry, and the changes through time. These people were striving for more efficient technology. Like we have today R&D, research and development team. They have also had such people that were devoting their time to understand, to improve the technology. And every little step forward was at the same time in both regions, which tells us that there was some kind of an coordinating system, which is another evidence that a kingdom was there at that time period. Because some of my colleagues claim that there was some tribes there, some tribes here, some opportunistic production, but the technological observations are very important for claiming that it was not disconnected.
Right.
So this was the paper in 2019. It's all there, and the connection between technological development, the people behind the technology, and social processes is quite clear, and I think it reflects the processes in this ancient kingdom of Edom.
So, who's to say that they didn't share the technology? The two separate people didn't share the technology with them. Why does it indicate a single polity between the north and the south? I mean, we have pottery styles. They travel out eventually, and they catch on, and everyone's doing the same thing in a general area. It's
right.
not, but so why does simultaneous
meaning that they were part of the same society?
Yeah.
Because metallurgy is very different than pottery. Again, it was the high tech of the time.
Okay.
Some of the components were like a guarded secret.
Okay.
So it's a different level of technology. And if it was a guarded secret of elite of metal workers, and it was you see the developments in both regions. At the same time, it means that they share the information. They did not compete with each other. And there are other claims along this line. For example, that in that scale of industry, this scale won't be sustainable if they were fighting or competing with each other.
So there's a time of peace or a relative peace between the two.
Yeah, what we see is the situation is, and the important observation also is that they were still nomadic. So what we see in the south is that at a certain point there was a coalition of tribes that was responsible for improving the metal industry, for having the trade protected and not disrupted, and we see that in the success of all of this system. And this in itself is evidence that there was some coordination and kind of an umbrella that we can see as an early kingdom.
So you're mentioning that this is a nomadic kingdom. Is this based on the fact that if it is a fact that you have a lack of buildings associated with it at the sites, the mining sites? If you do have buildings, what are the main periods of construction at the site?
Yeah, the basic observation is that we don't have any settled sites in Timna or in Feinan. We have very few buildings, probably of the elite or something like that, but we definitely don't. We just don't have buildings to accommodate all of the workers and miners in the region, and not to mention the population that were probably settled around the oasis, but in tents. So I think there is no argument about this society being nomadic. There are other debates about this observation, but this is a major change in our perception of this nomadic phase of the local kingdoms. Because most scholars accept the nomadic origin of ancient Israel.
Right.
And also Edom, Moab, Ammon. These little kingdoms emerged from a nomadic background. But the new thing here is that the common assumption that they could have created kingdoms only after complete sedentarization happened, only after everybody settled down, we challenge this assumption. And the observation from the south is that even during this phase of still being nomadic, they could have been very strong. They could have coordinated between tribes of a vast region to create something very successful. And this is a major change in biblical archaeology and also in biblical scholarship, because of this fundamental assumption that only settled society can create kingdoms. In case you don't find any permanent settlements, you can say that there was nothing in the region.
Right.
So the biblical description of the Midianites, for example, right? You read in the book of Judges that Gideon defeated the Midianites that had kings in the 11th century B.C., but there is nothing settled, no permanent settlements in Midian during this period. So scholars dismiss the historicity of this verse. But in the minute you understand that the reference for kings, for melachim, and the reference for mamlacha, for kingdom, does not necessarily mean a settled society, then it becomes much more interesting, and the archaeology cannot provide the answers that scholars claim it can.
Right.
See, it's really a methodological issue.
Do you feel like this is, I mean, this idea of an architectural bias that you've brought out to determine whether a kingdom was this size or that size, or it does make sense, definitely in my mind, for the South, this area that you're talking about. What is the limit, do you think, in your mind, of projecting your this idea of Edom into the kingdom of the Highland kingdoms, Philistine kingdoms, or?
I think it's relevant. It's very relevant to the kingdom in the highlands of ancient Israel, especially if you accept the nomadic background of this kingdom. Even more, like the situation in the south is the exception that proves the rule, because the only reason for us to know that there was a nomadic kingdom there is their engagement in copper production. So they became visible to us.
Right.
So we have the thousands of mines and a very large-scale industry. Before we came to Timna, everybody accepted that only an empire can be behind this major project. And now we say most of what was going on there happened after the Egyptians left the region.
Right.
So you cannot, belittle the power of this nomadic kingdom of Edom. It was a strong kingdom in the south.
Right.
But the important thing to remember is that we know about them only because they engaged in copper production. And the situation there in the highlands is different. We just can't see them. We don't see their tents. Sometimes in Adam's Artal survey, they found like a tent remain here and there, but it doesn't tell you the entire story, because from some tent remains you cannot reconstruct the structure of the society or anything like that. So if in the south the Edomites could have created something substantial, something important for the history of the region, definitely in the central country a similar process could have happened, and probably did happen. And if you go back to the biblical narrative, it's all about nomads creating a polity. And another thing...
This would probably be earlier, I would say, than at least from the biblical record. This is an earlier phenomenon than what would typically, I would say, exist in the South.
I think that
when they went through this change.
In the hill country, they went through the sanitarization process a little bit more fast than what we see in Edom. Edom, the first permanent settlements that we see are only in the late 8th centuries. So for quite a few centuries they were still nomadic. In the hill country it was a bit faster, but still much slower than archaeologists usually assume. And actually the common assumption is that as soon as you see this little little hamlets in the hill country, you can see all the population. But this is completely wrong.
Right.
It doesn't make a lot of sense because it takes a lot of time. It's a gradual change. And there is a lot of Western biases when we look at this change, because as Western people, we think that a lowly nomad, would run into a built house as soon as they can do that.
Right.
But it's not true. It takes a long process of change, a cultural change, a mental change, things that will take generations. And I believe that this was the situation in the hill country. I think first that we have archaeological evidence for that, because if you count the number of people based on the structures that you can see,
Right.
meaning the sedentary population, there is an amazing population growth between the, let's say, the 10th century to the 8th century, to the early 8th century, before the Assyrian conquest, that cannot be explained by a demographic growth, like a regular natural growth, and people were struggling with that. But the answer is very simple. There were always a lot of people there that are invisible to us, the archaeologists, and they became more and more settled through time. And more interestingly, maybe, is that when you go back to the text, you see that there is a lot of references to tents,
Right.
to Ohalim, all the way to the 10th, 9th centuries.
Yeah, Jeroboam's famous reprisal to your tents, O Israel.
Exactly, and there are many others. And scholars argue that this has to be figurative. Why? Because of our assumption, based on nothing, that only settled society can be part of this amazing kingdom. But this is our assumption. If you read the text as it is, it's clear that together with the settled people of the Israelites, there were still people dwelling in tents, being part of the same society. The Bible even bothered to remind us that one tribe, the Bnei Rechav, the sons of Rechav, the Rechabites, continued to live in tents all the way to the destruction of the temple.
Jeremiah's time.
Yes. So the picture is more complicated, and as soon as you understand that the nomads could have had a power, political power, like we see in the south, the whole picture changes.
I definitely think there's some value to what you're saying, to kind of remove the concept, our modern concept of what a nomad is. I suppose people might hear that term and they think of a backward people.
Exactly.
But you're saying that the discoveries that you found, particularly at Timna, the material culture that remained, even though the buildings weren't there, maybe they're intense, but what they were doing shows a level of sophistication and development that was incredible. And you say in your paper and your other papers that this really did surge around this 11th, 10th, and 9th century of peak copper production from these mines, but then you also have other elements that you're finding in the slag heaps and elsewhere that indicate the sophistication. Maybe you can talk about some of the other things outside the copper that you're finding.
Absolutely. We are very lucky in Timna because the dry climate preserved the organic materials. We have an amazing collection of textiles and leather and food remains. Things that even if you continue to excavate in Jerusalem another 200 years you won't find. So we have a window into this aspect of the society that you usually don't get. And this was quite incredible. The textiles in particular, when we first discovered some beautiful pieces with sophisticated weaving technique. I consulted with an expert on ancient textiles, Dr. Orit Shamir, and she couldn't believe it's so old, it's Iron Age. She told me it has to be like an important person in the Roman era.
Right.
But luckily, of course, you can date directly the organic materials. Right. So we could date these textiles directly to the 11th, 10th centuries B.C.E. Definitely evidence for an elite people at the site deep in the desert. And recently, this publication of ours, based on the work of Dr. Naama Sukeli, that some of the fragments, she analyzed them to see what the dyes are made of, and she was able to show that they were made of true purple. the argaman of the Bible,
Right.
which was the most expensive color in antiquity, and in the Bible it is the color of priests. If you go back to the Midianites, right, in Judges, so Gideon, what was the spoil he took from the kings of Midian? So gold and other things, but the important object was the purple garments of the kings themselves. And we have some fragments, physical fragments of textiles dyed with purple, with true purple, made of sea snails from the Mediterranean, inside of these waste piles of the industrial waste. So if people are questioning this idea of a nomadic king, a nomadic kingdom, they should consider the ability of this king and the elite to manifest their status and power by this kind of stuff.
Right.
Purple garments, a big tent, a large amount of cattle and hair and goats and sheep. They had other means. It doesn't necessarily have to be always manifested by monumental buildings. And we find this among the debris in Timna.
One thing that's really interesting, and you just kind of touched on it there. I mean, you're talking about an Edomite polity down here. The Edomite people, they're running the copper mines. You do find, like, if we go back to the Argaman, and it comes from a Murex snail. They've been publishing a lot about Talmud Shikmona lately, up by Haifa, to show that this was the location of a major dye production area. And your dye from Timna, which is 20 kilometers from the Gulf of Aqaba, where they also had Murex snails, where they could have produced it there or not. Am I wrong? Is there only one dye maker?
They are endemic to the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay, so you don't have them in the Red Sea?
We don't have them in the Red Sea, and we don't also have linen, and wool is actually not a very good place to raise sheep. Timna is extremely inhospitable. It's not like the Judean desert that you have like sheep and goat. Timna is an extreme desert, and this is why we have the preservation of these organic remains. So they got their textiles through trade in exchange to what they produced, which is copper, which was very important at that time. We cannot exaggerate the importance of copper. It's beautiful stuff.
Right.
It was used for the temple,
Right.
Huge quantities of it. But it also is the source for producing bronze,
Right.
which is a stronger metal that you can create weapons and agricultural tools with it. So in exchange for this very valuable commodity, they got purple garments. We see that they got like fish, all of our fish assemblage of the elite.
Like salted fish?
Exalted fish, and they all came from the Mediterranean Sea,
Right.
not from the Red Sea.
Okay.
Meaning that they had connections towards the north.
And this is 10th century you were talking about?
This is 10th century, 11th, 10th, 9th century B.C.E. And we have a huge amount of seeds of all the 7 species of the land, and also almonds, and really cool stuff that are not local, that were brought there by a long distance trade, including things that are, very common in Judah, like grape seeds and
Yeah, definitely no grapevines down there.
no grapevines down there. And so there were connections.
So I guess my question then becomes, how you can determine that this was an Edomite run site during the 10th century and not more of a kingdom of David or Solomon projecting their power to the south, using the Edomites, as the Bible even says. Is that a possibility, or it's outside your ability to determine who is the one in charge?
Well, of course it's a possibility. I'm saying that's a great question, and of course the question that everybody asks is, where did we find King Solomon's mines? Right? So this is a very difficult question to answer. I can tell you that the people operating the mines were the local tribes of the south. The Bible tells us about David going south of the Dead Sea, Valley of Salt, and conquering the region and putting garrisons all over the land. And since then, Edom was subjugated to Jerusalem. But you should remember that Edom was a brotherly nation to the Israelites. They were twins, right? Jacob and Esau. And most of the time there was kind of peace and good relations. And even during this time of subjugation, we should imagine just a pact or an agreement that the Edomites pay tax to Jerusalem. They bring to the city 20 ingots of copper every year. And in return, the Israelites won't disrupt the industry, and they will help with the trade and everything like that. This would be enough for the biblical author to depict the subjugation of Edom to Jerusalem. And you cannot expect from me as an archaeologist, or from any archaeologist for that matter, to be able to detect this agreement between the two nations in the archaeological record. I can tell you that the industry was flourishing during the 10th century, during the days of David and Solomon. It could not have been so successful if there were no...
If they're at war,
exactly.
Continuing that war with
exactly. So there had to be some kind of organization of the power relations, and subjugation of the Edomites to Jerusalem can be definitely part of it. Again, it doesn't have to be, villages of Israelites in the south. It doesn't actually make sense.
Well, it is. I mean, you've got the different nations that are surrounding, according to the biblical text, that you've got Ammon, Moab, Edom, and even the Philistines. These people, when David conquers them, they're not totally destroyed, removed from their land like the Canaanites. They are actually incorporated into the kingdom. They will do trade with them going forward.
And this is through pacts, agreements, and even marriages. There's a lot of politics, and it's very dynamic. And exactly, we should think about this. Even David's kingdom had this tribal origin, so all of this structure, the political structure, is very different than the empires that we have in mind, the Egyptian Empire or the Assyrian Empire. It's a different political structure, which would be much more difficult to detect archaeologically. This is why I think that our observations from the south give more, let's say, credit or more support to the more conservative approach towards the biblical historicity. I don't say that we have any proofs, but definitely
What do you mean by that?
We don't have any proof that David controlled Edom.
Right.
Because
for archaeology to do that.
That's exactly what I thought. That for archaeologists to do that, it would be impossible.
But what you can show, based on your excavations, is that copper production in this area in the south, when there is mass copper use and bronze use in the Bible, you do see them picking up at exactly the same time. So the atmosphere or the environment for the biblical text, it does check out.
Before our project and the Americans in Jordan, people, you read that story about David going to the south and conquering the Edomites, and there was nothing there archaeologically. This is because there were nomads, etc., and the dates of the mines were not correct, as we discussed.
Right.
So they were using the lack of evidence, the lack of archaeological evidence, to say that this story about David's conquest has to be anachronistic.
Right.
Because we have things in Edom only in the late 8th century, so it has to be written much, much later. But now we have a fantastic background, not only that people were there, the Edomites, but they also had the control over the most lucrative and important industry of the region. So we have a reason, the best reason for David to go to the south.
Right.
And we have the source of copper to the, to the temple that Solomon built.
And even the Bible talks about the objects themselves were cast somewhere in the valley themselves.
Yes, in the Jordan Valley in Sukkot. This is actually a very interesting point that brings us to the story of King David, King Solomon's mines, because we have this description of using copper and producing tools for the temple in the Jordan Valley from copper, but we don't have any explicit reference for Solomon's mines. Yeah. It's like a catchy title from an adventure book from the 19th century.
But it's not, there was King Solomon's mines in the Bible.
There is no King Solomon's mines in the Bible, but he did use a lot of copper. But surprisingly, if you go to the Book of Kings and see all the description of the construction of the temple, the biblical author in that case bothers to tell us where did the materials come from. So cedar, my name, Erez, came from Lebanon, right? Silver from Tarshish, maybe Spain. Gold, remember? Ophir. So it does. Copper, nothing. Silence. It does say that the craftsmen that produced the tools, the final product, were Phoenicians. But this is a different story. The origin of the copper, silence. And I think that the silence here is not just by chance. I think it's deliberate. Because if you remember the end of the relations between the two nations, between these nations, it didn't end well. There is an agreement among scholars that the Edomites betrayed the Israelites. We published recently a paper about the destruction of Tel Malchata, which was done a few decades after the Babylonians left, and probably by the Edomites.
Right.
So
the archaeomagnetism.
Exactly. This project with the archaeomagnetic dating of my student Yoav Vaklin, we see that there was something very bad happening then, and it is also reflected in the Bible because we have prophecies against this abhorred nation of the Edomites, against this bad people, and coming from the big perspective of metal in ancient societies. This pure material that comes out of the furnace had always some sacred qualities to it. It's not just because Solomon was using it for the temple. And you cannot associate this sacred material, this almost holy material, with this abhorred, religiously hated Edomites. So I think in later editions, this connection of this reference to Edomite copper was just deleted, omitted from the text. This is something I wrote as an idea. I cannot prove it, but it's very strange that there's no mention of where the copper came from. And I think that if you understand the sacred quality of the material, it makes sense that it won't be associated with the land of this abhorred Edomite. So this is part of the story. And for me, again, I was a student in Jerusalem. I did study with Ami Mazar and Amnon and people from the more conservative school. But I definitely believe that our project and the American one has provided in recent years a fantastic background for the biblical stories that are related to this period in time in this region.
So I am going to quote Nelson Glick once. It's probably customary to do in interviews with you.
In the South also.
This is just one quote from him, page 157. He came through these areas, I guess, the 30s. Is that when he was mainly through here? And he said this: the mineral deposits in the Wadi Arava had also, this is from his book, Rivers in the Desert, had also been worked in previous ages. In fact, early as the time of Abraham, before that in the Chalcolithic period too. Never, however, were they worked as intensively and in as coordinated a fashion as from Solomon's time on. So
this is correct.
That's correct, but he didn't have the proof, you would say, as much as obviously what you do.
His observations were based 1934. He came to the south. He spent one night in Timna, and this was all based on that. So, but he was a great archaeologist, and he
says it was surface finds a lot of the time.
Exactly, surface finds, but of course it was before radiocarbon was invented. So his tool was pottery sherds, and he was correct. The most intense production was during Solomon's era. Now we know it. This was in the early 20th century. Then in the second half of the 20th century, it was very fashionable to be very critical towards the biblical text.
Right.
Everywhere. It was together with a trend in world archaeology, in which they wanted to make archaeology much more scientific and more objective, and it affected also the local archaeologists here and biblical archaeologists as well. And what happened is that in Feinan, in Jordan, the British project on the plateau above Feinan was able to show that there was no permanent sites there before the late 8th century. So there was nothing significant there before the Assyrian impact, the Assyrian Empire. And accordingly, all the mines in the Feinan area were dated to the Assyrian Empire. And it was also kind of in fashion to say that only a big empire like the Assyrians can be behind this major project of copper mines in the desert. And in Timna, the opposite happened, like the opposite dating happened, but Rothenberg who continued.
He's another archaeologist that came along later in this era.
Yeah, he was the photographer of Nestor Glick in his expeditions, and then he decided in 1959 to start his own project, and he started a systematic excavations and surveys in Timna. For about 10 years, he accepted the Iron Age dates of the sites, but then in 69 there was this major discovery of the Egyptian temple, and he was so blinded by this discovery, and also it was fitting to the trend of being critical towards the Bible, and so he convinced everybody, including Nelson Glick, that it was only the Egyptians that were responsible for the big peak in production during the he changed the date to the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. So you see that Fenan and Timna, that were considered by Glick to be a single operation related to the time of King Solomon, were separated, were chronologically now dated completely differently.
8th to 13th century.
Exactly. Nothing related to this period that is much debated in archaeology. And everybody were happy. You know, only the Egyptians, only the Assyrians. The local people are capable of nothing. And this was a situation when I started working in Timna. This was an Egyptian site. Still today, I'm working with the park to change the signs, but still all the signs were about the Egyptian story.
Right.
And when we excavated the major site, a huge site that was published in a book by Rothenberg as an Egyptian smelting site, not a single date came from the Egyptian period, and this was when we knew that there was an issue here. The Egyptians were there, the temple is there. Of course, they came only for copper. That's, of course, part of the story, but it was a minor part. And I see this Egyptian phase of about 160 years, Seti the First or Ramesses the Fifth, as like the British mandate of the Edomites. Because the local leaders of the local tribes, they had like a few generations of experience of how to control people. What are the mechanisms of a kingdom? What is the definition of a kingdom or a state or like a polity? Is this ability to make people work for the elite and to structure the society in a way that will be stable and make everybody coordinate their work and their livelihood together? And they had this experience under the Egyptians, and then one day when the Egyptians didn't come back, right? The Bronze Age collapsed.
Right.
One day they couldn't, that's it, no more Egyptian expeditions. This was the time of the local leaders to get the tribes together and to establish a kingdom all over the region that I see as the nomadic kingdom of early Edom, and that's what they call it.
Well, yeah, and even the Bible references that, at least in terms of, they've got this comment that before, there was kings in Israel, we had kings in Edom.
Right, in Genesis 36.
Right.
And this is also a very interesting description. If you read it carefully, you see that the kings of these early Edomites were ruling from different cities. Now, if you talk about biases in interpretation, when you hear city in English, you think about, a city, New York, Manhattan. If you read, if you think about the city as an archaeologist, if you took the introductory class to archaeology, you think about Gordon Child's definition of an archaeological city. It has to be walled and very dense and all of that kind of stuff. But when you go to the ancient Hebrew, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but I have a lot of colleagues that I talk to, and you go back to the ancient Hebrew word, Ir, you see that Ir is used not only for a permanent settled city as we know today. It can be used also for like a gathering of tribes, a tent encampment, and things like that. So you see, this another example of biases that we have when we go to the text. So each of these early Edomite king rules from a different city, which is really appropriate for a nomadic society with tribes that have different centers, rather than a settled society with a capital, a ward, a palace, which a capital is a more permanent, specific location. So it really fits to the idea that these early kings were still nomads, and the idea that they were not nomads is only ours as modern scholars, as Western scholars, whatever. In the Bible, there is no nothing that makes it necessary to think about these kings as settled, as sedentary people. And this is, I think this is a methodological advancement actually for in our field, to think more in a more complicated way on things.
So you come out with this idea. You weren't looking for the 10th century. You weren't looking for. It reminds me actually of Yossi Garfinkel. Goes to Caiapha thinking he's going to find the 8th century, gets the carbon samples back, ends up being the 10th century, and he's like, "Uh-oh, what have I waded into? I have to publish this. What am I going to do?" You find yourself in the same situation. I have to publish. This is what it is. How has been the response? Have you felt like everybody welcomes this idea? There was a lot of pushback that maybe not, you're wrong, or...
So it's an ongoing discussion. The first major publication about that methodological insight was in 2019, the architectural bias in current biblical archaeology. And I published it in Vetus Testamentum, which is probably the best journal for biblical studies. And it was important for me to publish it in a venue for biblical scholars rather than only an archaeological venue, because we have a huge audience of mostly biblical scholars, historians of the period that are using our insights and conclusions to to build their own theories and to investigate the text better. So. And this audience is less familiar with the challenges of archaeological interpretation. For them, they get some conclusions of this archaeologist or this archaeologist, and it's very hard to really understand the challenges behind these conclusions. And I wanted this audience to be aware of the challenges, especially regarding this nomadic phase, and especially regarding this assumption that only settled people can be part of a big kingdom, which is really important because, for example, one of the arguments against a big kingdom of David is counting the number of people in Judah and getting a very small number.
Based on the physical buildings. So.
These physical buildings are only the settled people. And if you agree that, there are probably tens of thousands of people not in physical building, it changes the interpretation. So I published it then, and of course I got a lot of pushbacks, especially from the critical school. Finkelstein wrote a paper in Antigua Oriente criticizing this approach. I thank Romina de la Casa, the editor, who invited me immediately to respond in the same issue of the journal. So I put my ideas there as well. But recently Nadav Ne'eman wrote something, and there is also pushbacks from the people working with the British in Jordan that said that there is no Edomite kingdom before the late 8th century. Piotr Bielkowski and others, they wrote a paper in Basel. I will respond to things in that time. I have a lot on my table, but the discussion is very interesting in itself. I think it's a major change in our in the way we used to think about these ancient societies, and it will take time. I think that what we have in the South, this evidence that I'm coming from, it's just a very theoretical, philosophical.
Yeah, you're coming from the hard sciences, really, and you're bringing that into an archaeological concept to kind of recreate your history as you would see it based on that. Right. It's not from a biblical text first, and then
not at all. I was interested in just studying the Egyptian technology of this time, the dates came back, and this was the big deal was when you understand that you didn't excavate the cities or villages. That these people were nomads, and what we know, all of these things I can tell you about their flourishing industry, about their organization, about the garments of the elite and the kings, is just by chance, just because they engaged in copper production.
Right.
And there could have been an Edomite kingdom there, whose economy was based on trade. The Arabian trade already started to happen there then, and I couldn't tell you anything about it because they wouldn't leave anything physical behind.
Right.
So if you accept the nomadic component of the biblical stories, you also have to accept and understand the complication of the archaeology of this phase, and the way that people coped with this challenge until now was to say that they were not important, they were negligible, there were some Bedouins in the south, so it's okay that we don't see them because until they settled down, they didn't do anything significant. But if this is not correct, and I think in the south you see that this is not correct, we have to now take this component into account as something that could have had a big effect on the history of the region.
Cool. So you said you've got, before we start the interview, that you've got another few seasons at Timna that you're planning, maybe 5 or something like that. But it's more of a surgical excavation where a couple of weeks and then you go back to the lab. So
and also you've mentioned Nelson Glick's description. So Nelson Glick also, another thing that he was correct about, that the story of the South, the mines, is not only about this period. It started very early in the Chalcolithic. It's not the earliest site of copper production anywhere in the world, like Rothenberg wanted it to be, but it's very close to the early days of metallurgy anywhere, and it goes all the way to the early Islamic period. So in the recent seasons, we also invest in investigating some technological aspects of other periods.
Right.
So we extend the scope of the chronology, and this puts back in context the Iron Age and the biblical period, and Glick was right, this was the most intense, incomparable to other period, even not to the Roman period, which during this time, Fenan was a Roman metalla, like an imperial production center.
Right.
It was still smaller than what was happening there in time.
So you've got the Roman structures associated. I mean, you would have architecture associated to the Roman period there.
Yes, we have even churches from the Byzantine period.
So it's meant, but you're saying the copper production from an earlier period outstrips that with the big buildings, or
Yeah.
Did you find, or are you finding that the efficiency of the copper production, so the amount of copper produced, slag created, that ratio, or does that ever go backwards?
In the long way, if you talk about the thousands of years, so yeah, sometimes technology was forgotten and they had to start again. But during this continuous period of production from the Egyptians all the way to the 9th century, it ended in the 9th century. Because of environmental issues and also because of the Aramean intervention in the region. But during this almost 500 years of continuous production, there is also only improvement.
Okay.
And the peak, like the most sophisticated industry during the 9th century, let's say, is not less than what the Roman were using. So it was really, really high achievement in the smelting sites, but also in the mines. There are in Fenan mining shafts that are more than 70 meters in depth. And they are part of this early Iron Age story. So it was not something, it was something very sophisticated. And again, the interesting thing is that we don't have an empire behind. We don't even have a settled kingdom behind. We have a kingdom based on confederation of tribes. It's true that nomads throughout history were usually on the margin of the society, but we have cases in which nomads created huge kingdoms and accumulated power. The Mongol Empire was the strongest, the biggest empire in the history of the world, and it was based on nomads in the first generations. We have the Nabateans that were nomads and before they settled down, and still they had kings before they settled down. So maybe these are exceptions, but we have kind of this. We have these cases, and if you think about this specific period in the history of the land, this is exactly the period when you should expect these nomads, these marginal tribes, you should expect them to accumulate power and to be very strong, because think about the late Bronze Age. We have the city-states, and
The vacuum.
Before the vacuum, the stabilizer, the Egyptians were here, right? Every time there was some Apiru or Shasu making some problems, they wrote a letter to the pharaoh and they sent some soldiers, and they were the stabilizing force. And now one day they disappeared, they collapsed, So this was the time for these marginal people to actually accumulate power and to control the city-states. And this is exactly the story of the Bible. And if you take into account also the possibility that it was all related to a crisis in climate, the big Bronze Age collapse was also related to the deteriorating climate. This was also something that gave advantage to nomadic people because they can move.
Right.
If you are permanent, if you are settled and you have the well is dried up, you are in trouble. You will be weak and you don't know what to do. But if this is the time for the tribes that can move around to be strong and to exercise their power actually over the settled people. And this is the story. This is the story of David with the Philistines. And the Philistines were urbanites, were people, settled people. And this is what we see in the basic story of the Bible. That this was the time of the nomadic tribes to be substantial in the history of the region. And maybe it's not intuitive to a modern Western people like us that think about the Bedouins. Even the Bedouins today, they are against central authority and it's like a dangerous place to go, even today in the 21st century. But it doesn't always have to be like that. And I think that we have evidence that in the early Iron Age it was not like that. And it was the time for the local tribes to create this Edomite kingdom, which we have, luckily we have the evidence because of the copper, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and of course also ancient Israel, that almost all scholars agree had a nomadic background as well.
Cool. Well, thanks very much for your contribution to this, this
aspect.
understanding, this aspect of it. It certainly does change the way we think about, what could provide evidence for quality statehood, call it what you like.
It makes our life more complicated, and the challenge is
Well,
great.
we're always into more complicated, and at least things that give a broader picture to the situations. Not everything is just black and white, as we would put it into our parameters to decide these things. And I think what you can find in a bunch of trash, a big slag heap, or in some ways, it could outweigh what you would find in a massive city in determining how people anciently lived. So thank you very much, and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Cool. Do you have any questions?
Well, I do have one, whether or not you want to put it in.
Yeah, you can just ask.
So you talk about the copper coming out of Timna and all that. Has there been much analysis from other sites that shows copper that came from those sites?
It's an excellent question. And we, the people who work in the mines, so I've been there for more than 20 years now, because I started my master thesis. We just see the quantities of the waste, and we know that it was a huge amount, much more than local consumption, not of the Edomites and not even of the ancient Israelites. But it was hard for us to convince the scholarly community that it was something big and not negligible in the south. But then in recent years there are more and more studies on the actual metal artifacts, copper artifacts from other sites that indicate without any question that it came from the Aravah. A German team, for example, worked on copper from Delphi and Olympia from the 10th century BC. It's all from the Aravah team. We had a project with the Israel Museum on Egyptian artifacts from the 21st dynasty, which is exactly the time of the early days of David, 1010 BC, something like that. All of the artifacts is like 4, but very typical, Timna copper. There is another team working on metals from Lebanon, the Arabah. An Israeli scholar, Naama, probably know from the Hebrew University. Naama has done a lot of research on that aspect from sites around Israel from that period, 11th, 10th centuries BC. It's all from the Arabah. We don't have copper from this period in Jerusalem. I think Eilat might have some artifacts. They were not analyzed yet. I'm not sure if it's the 10th or 9th centuries. But Naama analyzed an artifact from Gilo, very close to Jerusalem. Iron 1, Arabah. So it's all there. And again, for us it's not a big surprise.
Yeah,
and I'm sure that in the future we will find it also in Damascus and other places copper came in this period. There was a window in the history of the region that the Aravah was the main supplier of copper for the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, and this was because Cyprus was very, very weak back then, and this was kind of a window of opportunity that was not available again later.
I do think that's interesting in terms of what you were saying, not to push back too much on your theory of the biblical hatred for the Edomites.
No.
But the fact that Edom is so close and it's a no-brainer, of course we're going to say, why are we even mentioning where the copper comes from? Everybody knows where the copper comes from because it's so close to us.
I'm going with that. This can be two parallel explanations.
Yeah, it could. Yeah.
It's so obvious that it's an Edomite because it's so common. There is no other option.
You're right, especially if it's going north to Greece and elsewhere like that.
Yeah, I'm telling you, there was no other option in that particular time in the 10th century rather than Edomite copper. So maybe it was so obvious that it's another way to go. Very nice.
So in Delphi, is that the furthest away so far that you have found this?
I guess so.
Copper?
With in distance, it's
amazing.
the farthest away.
We need to find a Phoenician shipwreck somewhere way western Mediterranean and have some bronze items there, perhaps.
Actually, there is a publication from I think last year or so from Sardinia. It's a bit controversial. The data I'm talking about, the real analytical data and the arguments between the people who are doing isotopes. Also, the scientists argue between themselves sometimes about interpretations. It's not always clear. But the scholar who led this project strongly believed that his data support Timna copper in Sardinia, which would be much farther than Greece, during the 10th century BC.E. We might see such evidence in the future as well, and this can explain many things. I'm telling you, just think about you are. You're many years talking to biblical archaeologists engaged in the field and all of that kind of stuff. So think about all of the many articles and books talking about the economy of Judah in that time period and trying to understand what can be the source of wealth of this remote place in Jerusalem. Right. The land of Jerusalem is much poorer than Samaria, for example, so that's why Israel has to be much stronger all the time and things like that. But all of these calculations are based on the environment, the immediate environment, the amount of gold, the amount of sheep, olive oil, wine, things like that. But if you factor in the economy of copper, which is invisible, it's not that if the Jerusalem engaged in this trade, you would find a lot of ingots all over the place.
Right.
Metal you can recycle. It never lasts in the archaeological site unless it was hoarded or something unique. So it's kind of an invisible economic factor, which is huge, because if Jerusalem indeed benefited from this copper trade, it can very much explain the wealth of the city in this time period. Our assumption is that all of its economy was based on the local land and some connections with other entities is not the whole story. It's not the entire story. And definitely the copper was a major thing. The closest entity to the Edomite copper trade was Judah. Mm-hmm. It was Judah. If they wanted to ship copper to Gaza, it had to go through the Beersheba Valley. So for me, even if David was a very small king or whatever, he had to be familiar with this trade and had to, at least for sure, he wanted to benefit from it. It gives us a lot of food for thought, and we should just remember that the archaeological record is very fragmented, and it always tells us a very small part.
That's what we often talk about, is that archaeology is always going to produce the most minimal account of what actually happened. Because
absolutely, and also not in an equal way the sedentary and the nomads. We have to remember that the nomads will always be much less represented, and certain commodities. Copper would be much less represented than wine that had to be shipped with jars.
Right.
So we have to think about the quality of the evidence and the different, the different type of evidence that we should expect for the life of this engineer.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much for watching the interview of Professor Ben-Yosef. Thank you very much to him for taking this time to be with us. I did want to, again, give a plug to our magazine. This is a magazine, Let the Stone Speak. It's similar content to what you see on the podcast, but it's in printed form. That's different articles that are really going to help you make sense in a different medium. The significance of archaeological discoveries coming out of Israel during the time period of the Bible. Our latest issue is called Finding the Hittites. This is available to you by going to our website, armstronginstitute.org, and scrolling down till you find a place where you can request the magazine. And that'll give you a free subscription of 3 magazines, and then you can renew for the next year. This is a magazine that's always going to be for free for you, so there's no hidden cost obligations or follow-ups. All you need to do is simply renew every single year. This is a magazine that comes out 6 times per year. We're actually going to have a really big magazine for the next one. It's going to cover the history of the kingdoms of David and Solomon. So there will be a segment about Timna in the magazine, but it's going to be more comprehensive, about 80 pages of the very latest archaeological discovery that backs up and supports the narrative in the Bible of the kingdom of David and Solomon. And so you'll want to sign up for that now to make sure that you're on the mailing list to get that magazine when it comes out in another month or so. So again, the website's armstronginstitute.org. You can also just write an email to letters@armstronginstitute.org requesting the magazine, putting your address in there. Wherever you are in the world, we'll make sure that you get a copy.